Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Vasya. I'm calling to you from Russia, from my kitchen. You know, in the 1990s, I was, how do you say, not a good guy. Street criminal, you understand? Did some time in prison, saw some crazy shit. But that's behind me now. I got family, normal life. Today, I want to tell you a story that even for Russia, man, this one is dark. Very dark. You Americans, you think you know serial killers, right? You got your Ted Bundy, your John Wayne Gacy, but let me tell you about Andrei Chikatilo. We called him Rostovsky Patrashitel. Rostovsky Patrashitel means the Rostov Ripper. In the West, you know him as the Red Ripper. 53 people. 53. Mostly kids and young women. And you know what's the craziest part? Soviet government, they refused to believe it was happening. In their perfect communist society, serial killers don't exist. That's capitalist problem, they said. 12 years this monster hunted in the forests near train stations. 12 years. Trust me, by the end of this story, you're gonna understand how fucked up things were in Soviet Union in those days. So grab your coffee, sit down, and let me tell you the real story of the Rostov Ripper. This is how it really was. Let's go. November 6th, 1990. Rostov-on-Don, Rostov-on-Don. That's a big industrial city in southern Russia, okay? About 700 miles south of Moscow, roughly the distance from New York to Chicago. Imagine you're there in late autumn, cold, gray, miserable. Soviet Union is falling apart. Store shelves are empty. People are angry and desperate. That day, a 54-year-old man boards the Electrica. That's what we call the commuter train in Russia. Not like your Amtrak, you understand? These are old Soviet trains, beat up, always packed with people, smell like cigarettes and unwashed bodies. The Electrica runs from Rostov to a small station called Leskos, means Forest Management Station. All around that area, nothing but lesopolosi, forest belts, miles and miles of trees. This man, his name is Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. Looks harmless, you know? Grandfather type. Glasses, balding, wearing cheap Soviet clothes. Probably a used suit from commission shop. Polite, intelligent looking. Nobody would suspect anything. On the train, he spots his target. Svetlana Korostik, 22 years old. Young woman, probably going somewhere, maybe to see friends or family. Chikatilo, he's good at this by now. He's been doing it for 12 years. He smiles, starts conversation. Very polite, very friendly. In those days in Soviet Union, people talked to strangers on trains all the time. It's normal, you know? Long, boring rides, nothing else to do. Svetlana, she sees this nice old man, thinks nothing wrong. He tells her he has a dacha. That's like a little cottage or garden plot outside the city. Every Soviet family wanted dacha. It was like prestige thing. Plus, you could grow vegetables there because stores had nothing. He says, "Why don't you come with me? We can talk more. I'll make you tea." And she agrees. They get off at Lesostep station. This is important detail. Stations in Soviet Union, they're not like in America with parking lots and lights and security. No, man. It's just a platform in the middle of nowhere. Maybe one light bulb, maybe a drunk militiaman. That's Soviet police, sleeping somewhere. Especially these small forest stations, completely deserted. They walk along the Lesopolosa, the forest belt. These were planted by Stalin's order after World War II to prevent soil erosion. But really, they created perfect hunting grounds for predators. 2 kilometers they walk, more than a mile, deeper into the woods, away from any houses or roads. And then, Chikatilo transforms. The polite grandfather disappears. The monster emerges. He attacks Svetlana, ties her up with rope he brought with him, because of course he came prepared. He's done this 52 times before. Then he takes out his knife. What happens next? Man, even for someone like me who saw a lot of shit in prison, this is hard to talk about. He stabs her. Multiple times. But it's not just killing. He's doing something much worse. He cuts off the tip of her tongue. He cuts off her nipples. He removes her uterus and ovaries. Some of these parts, he eats them, right there in the forest. When he's finished, he covers her body with her own shirt and tights, throws the rest of her clothes into bushes, and walks calmly to the next station, Leskos. Here's where it gets interesting. At Leskos station, there's a militiaman in plain clothes, civilian clothes. You understand? His name is Igor Rybakov. He's there on patrol because there's been reports of suspicious activity in the area. Soviet Union in 1990. Crime is everywhere. Militia is desperate to look like they're doing something. Rybakov sees this man emerge from the forest belt. Looks intelligent, well-dressed enough, but something is wrong. The man has leaves stuck all over his clothes, like he was rolling around on the ground. And there's a scratch on his cheek. Fresh scratch. Looks like fingernails. Rybakov approaches. Dokumente, пожалуйста. Documents, please. In Soviet Union, you had to carry internal passport everywhere. If militia asks for documents and you don't have them, big problem, you understand? They can take you to station, hold you for 3 days, make your life hell. Chikatilo stays calm. He's been in this situation before, caught by militia near crime scenes. He hands over his passport. Rybakov writes down the information. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, born October 16th, 1936, resident of Novocherkassk, that's a city near Rostov. What were you doing in the forest? Just taking a walk, enjoying nature. In November, in freezing cold, with leaves all over you and scratch on your face. But Rybakov, he's just a regular cop. You know, he's not detective. He takes the information and lets Chikatilo go. Later, this will haunt him forever. 3 days later, November 9th, someone finds women's clothing scattered near the train tracks. Rybakov hears about it, and something clicks in his brain. He remembers the strange man from the forest. He reports it to his superiors. We need to search between Lesovstep and Leskos stations. 4 days after that, November 13th, a large team of investigators combs through the forest belt. They find Svetlana Korostik's body. The condition, it's so bad that even experienced detectives get sick. One of them will say later, I've seen many bodies in my career, but this was something from a horror film. Now the militia knows. This is not random crime. This is a serial killer. They remember Rybakov's report about the man with leaves on his clothes and scratches on his face. They pull Chikatilo's information. They start surveillance immediately. 1 week later, November 20th, 1990, they make their move. Chikatilo walks out of a cafe, going there for kvass, maybe, or beer. Kvass is traditional Russian drink, like fermented bread, you know? Non-alcoholic, but in Soviet times it was everywhere, sold from yellow tanks on the streets. The detectives surround him. Ruki na kapot, hands on the hood. They slam him against a car, snap handcuffs on him. Chikatilo doesn't resist. He's calm, almost relieved, some will say later. They have him, but here's the problem. They have no solid evidence, just circumstantial. In Soviet legal system, actually in any legal system, you can't convict someone just because they were walking near a crime scene with scratches on their face. The law says they can hold him for only 10 days without charges. 10 days to make him confess. If he stays silent, they have to let him go. And Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo knows his rights. He's intelligent man, studied law, almost became lawyer. He knows exactly what to do. Say nothing. For 9 days, he sits in the interrogation room like a statue, completely silent, doesn't answer questions, doesn't react to accusations, doesn't even blink. The detectives are desperate. They try everything, good cop, bad cop, bringing in evidence photos, lying about what they know. Nothing works. On the 9th day, with only 1 day left before they have to release him. Someone has an idea. They call in a psychiatrist. His name is Alexander Bukhanovsky. This man, he's been studying the case for years, creating a psychological profile of the killer. He understands what makes this monster tick. The investigators tell him, "You have 24 hours. Make him talk." Bukhanovsky enters the interrogation room, but he doesn't interrogate. Instead, he talks. He talks about childhood trauma, about sexual dysfunction, about the desperate need for power and control, about hunger and humiliation and rage that builds up over a lifetime. He talks to Chikatilo like a doctor talks to a patient, like a confessor talks to a sinner, and somehow it works. On November 29, 1990, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo begins to cry, and then he begins to talk. For the next several months, he will confess to 53 murders, 53 people. He will describe each one in horrifying detail. Where, when, how, why. But to understand how this happened, how a Soviet schoolteacher became one of history's most brutal serial killers, we need to go back, way back, to Ukraine in the 1930s, to the time of Stalin, to a childhood so traumatic it would break any person's mind. Let me tell you about the boy who became the monster. Part 1. Childhood in Hell, 1936 to 1954. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born October 16, 1936, in a small village called Yabloknoy, means apple village, in what was then Kharkov Oblast in Ukraine. Now it's Sumy Oblast. For you Americans, Ukraine was part of Soviet Union then, like a state in your country, but not really, more like a colony, you understand? The year 1936. Man, this is important for you to understand. 3 years earlier, in 1932-33, Stalin deliberately caused a famine in Ukraine to punish the peasants who resisted collectivization. That's when government takes all private farms and forces everyone into collective farms. This famine, we call it Holodomor. In Ukrainian, it means murder by hunger. Between 3 and 7 million people starved to death. 3 to 7 million. Think about that. When Chikatilo is born, his family is still recovering from this horror. They're poor, not just poor like American poor with food stamps and welfare, no. Soviet poor means you eat grass and tree bark to survive. You boil your leather shoes to make soup. You watch your neighbors die in the street. Chikatilo's father, Roman, he's a Communist Party member, works on a collective farm. When World War II starts, in 1941, he goes to fight the Nazis. He becomes a partisan commander. These are guerrilla fighters who operated behind German lines. Very brave, very dangerous work. But then Roman gets captured by the Germans. He ends up in a concentration camp. Now, here's something you need to understand about Stalin's Soviet Union. If you were captured by the enemy, you were automatically considered a traitor. Didn't matter if you fought bravely. Didn't matter if you suffered in a camp. If you surrendered instead of dying, you betrayed the motherland. In 1945, American forces liberate the camp. They send the Soviet POWs back home. Roman Chikatilo probably thinks, "Thank God, I'm going home to my family." But when he arrives in Soviet Union, instead of a hero's welcome, he gets arrested immediately. Stalin's NKVD, that's the secret police, predecessors of KGB, they interrogate him, torture him, send him to Gulag. That's Soviet labor camp, basically a death sentence. For years, his own government puts him in camps for years, just because he was captured in war. So little Andrei grows up without a father. And his father isn't dead. No, he's alive, but he's a Prodotel-Rodiny, traitor of the motherland. In Soviet Union, this is a stain on the whole family. People avoid you. Nobody wants to be associated with you. Your kids get bullied at school. You can't get good jobs. It's like, imagine in America during Red Scare in the 1950s. If your father was accused of being a communist spy, That kind of stigma, but 10 times worse. Andrei's mother, she's left alone with the kids during the war. They're starving. The boy eats grass, roots, anything. He's so malnourished that he develops hydrocephalus, water on the brain. His skull swells up, puts pressure on his brain. This causes permanent damage, affects his development. And there's something else, something that will haunt Andrei his entire life. His mother tells him a story. She says, "You had an older brother, Stepan, in the famine of 1932 to 33 during the Holodomor. We were so hungry, the villagers caught him and ate him. Cannibalism, you understand? They ate your brother. Now, here's the thing. There's no evidence this brother ever existed. No birth certificate, no documents, nothing. Probably the mother made it up, or maybe she believed it herself. Who knows? But imagine being a small child and hearing this story. Imagine growing up believing your older brother was murdered and eaten by neighbors. On top of this, the boy suffers from enuresis, bedwetting. Not just as a baby, no, until he's 12 years old. 12. Every night he wets the bed, and every morning his mother beats him and humiliated him for it. Screams at him, calls him worthless, weak, not a real man. In Soviet communal apartments, kommunalka, we called them, families often shared bathrooms and kitchens with several other families. Everybody knew everybody's business. So all the neighbors know that Andrei Chikatilo pisses himself every night. Kids at school know. He becomes the punching bag, the target. They call him baby and razmaznya. That means weakling, crybaby. They beat him up constantly. Not just bullying like you have in America. No, we're talking about real beatings, you understand? Soviet kids. They were brutal. And the teachers? They don't care. That's just how it was. Andrei has no friends. Zero. He spends all his time reading books, hiding from the world. He's smart though, very smart. He loves politics, reads Marx and Engels and Lenin, memorizes their writings. He becomes a true believer in communism. In his mind, communism will save him, will save everyone. If only the party's ideals were followed correctly, the world would be perfect. This is how his brain works, you see? Reality is horrible, so he escapes into ideology. In high school, he becomes very active in Komsomol. That's the Communist Youth League. He edits the wall newspaper. We called it Sten Gazeta. These were propaganda newspapers posted on walls in schools and factories. He makes agitation posters. He does all the organizational work that nobody else wants to do. The politics, it gives him some sense of importance, some identity beyond being the bedwetter everyone mocks. But with girls, complete disaster. Soviet education in those days, there was no sex education, you understand? Nothing. Boys and girls knew nothing about sex, except what they heard from older kids or figured out themselves. Andrei, he's so awkward, so strange-looking, so desperate. Girls want nothing to do with him. One time, when he's a teenager, he pushes down his sister's friend. She's 13 years old and pins her to the ground. Not to rape her, just physical contact, you know? He gets an erection immediately. Ejaculates right there in his pants without even touching himself. This terrifies him. This feeling of losing control, of his body betraying him. He calls it neshashtya, misfortune, and makes a vow. He literally swears an oath. I will never touch any woman except my wife. This is important to understand because it shows you his mindset. He's not hypersexual teenager trying to sleep with every girl. He's the opposite. He's terrified of sex, terrified of his own urges, trying desperately to control himself. The oath doesn't work, obviously, but it shows you this is not a normal predator. This is someone whose sexuality is completely broken from the start. In 1954, Chikatilo graduates from school with almost perfect grades. He's determined to escape his horrible childhood, to become someone important. He applies to Moscow State University, MGU, the best university in Soviet Union, to study law. And he fails the entrance exams. Why? Maybe his grades weren't good enough. Maybe he choked on the tests. Or maybe, and this is what he believed, maybe the university rejected him because his father was a traitor of the motherland. In Soviet Union, your family history determined everything. If you had the wrong relatives, you couldn't get into good schools, couldn't get good jobs, couldn't advance in life. This rejection crushes him. His dream of becoming important, respected, powerful, gone. So he settles. He enrolls in a technical school for communications, then later in a local institute. He studies, but his heart isn't in it. He's just going through the motions, marking time until he has to serve in the army. In Soviet Union, every man had to serve 2 years in the military. No exceptions, unless you were seriously disabled or had major connections. Chikatilo serves from 1957 to 1959. Later, he will claim that he was bullied and even sexually assaulted by other soldiers. But we can't verify this. He might be lying, trying to create sympathy, trying to explain his crimes by claiming he's a victim too. What we know for sure is that when he gets out of the army in 1959, he's 23 years old and he's still a virgin. Never even kissed a girl. In Soviet Union, where men were expected to be rough and sexual and dominant, this is shameful beyond belief. He moves to Rodionova-Nezhvetayskaya, that's a small town near Rostov-on-Don, and gets a job as a telephone engineer. He's good with technology, good with details. He finds a room to rent, settles into a quiet life, and then he meets a girl. Her name we don't know. The sources just call her his fiancée. She's 19, he's 25. They start dating. Things are going well. Marriage is discussed. Chikatilo is hopeful. Finally, he'll have a normal life, a wife, maybe children someday. They're alone together one evening. Things get physical, they try to have sex, and Chikatilo can't perform. He has erectile dysfunction, impotence. The girl is shocked, then angry, then disgusted. She breaks off the relationship immediately. But worse, she tells her friends. She tells everyone. In a small Soviet town where everybody knows everybody, this spreads like wildfire. Soon, the entire town knows. Andrei Chikatilo is impotent. He's not a real man. He's defective. The humiliation is total, absolute, crushing. Chikatilo flees the town in shame, moves to another place, tries to start over. But the damage is done. Something inside him has broken permanently. He's 26 years old. He's failed at everything. Failed to get into university, failed to have a successful military service, failed to have sex, failed to be a man. The rage is building. The humiliation is accumulating. And soon, very soon, it will need an outlet. Marriage and Hidden Dysfunction, 1963-1978. After his disastrous engagement and subsequent humiliation, Chikatilo moves away and tries to rebuild his life. A year passes. He's lonely, isolated, working as a phone engineer, living in a small room. Then his sister Tatiana intervenes. You gotta understand, in Soviet society, family was everything. If you were unmarried by your mid-20s, people thought something was wrong with you. And Tatiana knows her brother is suffering, knows he needs a wife to be considered normal. She introduces him to her friend, Feodosia Odnacheva. Feodosia works as the director of a kindergarten, decent job in Soviet Union, respectable position. She's a few years younger than Andrei, simple woman from a working family. Not particularly attractive, but not ugly either. Most importantly, she's still single and getting older, so she's not too picky. Andrei and Feodosia begin dating. It's awkward. Andrei is still terrified of sex, still traumatized by his previous failure. But Feodosia is patient, or maybe just desperate to get married before she becomes too old. In Soviet Union, unmarried woman over 25 was considered staraya deva, old maid, basically worthless in society's eyes. They get married in 1963. Andrei is 27 years old. He's convinced himself that with a patient, understanding wife, his sexual problems will resolve themselves. They don't. On their wedding night, Andrei can't perform, can't maintain an erection. They try again and again over the following weeks and months. Sometimes he manages brief penetration, but usually he ejaculates immediately before even entering her, or he can't get hard at all. For Feodosia, this is devastating. She married expecting a normal sexual relationship, maybe children. Instead, she has a husband who can't fulfill his basic marital duties. She's angry, frustrated, feels cheated. They fight constantly. But in Soviet Union, divorce was shameful and difficult. You had to go through whole process, get permission from local party committee, explain why your marriage failed. It was humiliating for everyone involved, and often your career suffered afterward. So people stayed in bad marriages rather than face the stigma of divorce. Andrei and Feodosia stay together, but it's toxic, poisonous relationship. Here's the crazy thing. Despite his impotence, they manage to have 2 children. How? Chikatilo figures out a workaround. He can't maintain an erection during normal arousal. But if he gets angry, if there's violence, aggression, an element of force, sometimes his body responds. So he essentially forces himself on his wife, using aggression to overcome his dysfunction. It's not quite rape, but it's close. It's certainly not loving or consensual in any meaningful way. Their daughter Ludmila is born in 1965. Their son Yuri in 1969. Chikatilo is not a good father. He's distant, cold, wrapped up in his own misery. But he doesn't abuse the kids directly. He's not violent at home. To his neighbors and coworkers, he seems like a normal Soviet man. Quiet, hardworking, keeps to himself. Around this time, Chikatilo changes careers. He's tired of being a telephone engineer. He wants something more prestigious, something that will make him feel important. So he goes back to school and gets a teaching degree in Russian language and literature. In 1971, he starts working as a schoolteacher. Now, let me explain something about Soviet schools. Teachers had tremendous authority and respect. Students called them by name and patronymic, like Andrei Romanovich, and used the formal you form. Teachers could hit students if they misbehaved. Parents usually sided with teachers, not with their kids. It was a position of real power. For someone like Chikatilo, who felt powerless everywhere else in his life, this is intoxicating. Finally, he has people who have to listen to him, who have to respect him, who can't mock him or reject him. But of course, it doesn't work out. The students quickly realize that Andrei Romanovich is strange. He's too soft-spoken, too nervous, too weird. His lessons are disorganized. He can't maintain classroom discipline. And worse, much worse, he starts behaving inappropriately with students. He offers to help female students with their homework, asks them to stay after class, finds excuses to touch them on the shoulder or back. With boys, too, especially younger boys, he's overly friendly, overly touchy. The students start complaining. Parents complain. But in Soviet system, firing a teacher was very difficult. You needed documented evidence, formal proceedings, approval from Education Ministry. So, the school just moves him from school to school, hoping the problem will go away. Between 1971 and 1981, Chikatilo works at several different schools in the Rostov region. Each time, the pattern repeats. Complaints about his weird behavior, inappropriate touching, poor teaching. Each time, he gets quietly transferred to another school, and in December 1978, he finds his outlet. Part 3. The First Murder, December 22nd, 1978. December 22nd, 1978. Shakhty, a coal mining town near Rostov-on-Don. For Americans, imagine a Rust Belt town, industrial, poor, depressing. Shakhty means mines in Russian. The whole town existed to dig coal out of the ground. Air quality was terrible. Buildings were gray and crumbling. People drank heavily to cope with the misery. Chikatilo is living in Shakti at this time, working as a teacher. His marriage is falling apart. His reputation at work is terrible. He's 42 years old and his life is a complete failure. But he has a secret. Earlier that year, he managed to buy a small house, really more like a shed, a crumbling one-room building in a rundown part of town. In Soviet Union, owning any property was a big deal, even a crumbling shed. He told his wife and the authorities that he bought it for storage, maybe to use as a workshop, but that's not what it's for. The house is located on Mezhevoy Lane, a dead-end street with almost no traffic. Perfect privacy. Chikatilo has been going there for months, just sitting alone, thinking his dark thoughts. He's been having increasingly violent sexual fantasies. Fantasies about controlling someone, hurting someone, making them suffer. On December 22nd, it's cold, below freezing, snow on the ground, getting dark early in the afternoon, like it does in Russian winter. Chikatilo is near the local train station, the same place he used to be as a telephone engineer, working with communications equipment. He knows this area well. He sees a little girl. Her name is Yelena Zakudnova, nicknamed Lenka, 9 years old. She's wearing a winter coat, trying to catch a bus home from school. But the buses in Soviet Union were notoriously unreliable. They came late. They were packed full. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Lenka is standing there in the cold, waiting. Chikatilo approaches. He's good at seeming harmless. He's a teacher, after all, used to talking to children. He says something like, "It's so cold out here. I live nearby. Why don't you come warm up for a few minutes? I'll give you some tea, then you can catch your bus." The girl hesitates. But he seems nice. He's an adult. He's not threatening. And she's freezing. So she goes with him. They walk to his house on Mezhevoy Lane. He unlocks the door. They go inside. The house is small, barely furnished, has a wood stove for heat. He locks the door behind them. And then the monster emerges. Chikatilo attacks the child. He tries to rape her, but of course he can't. He's impotent. His rage and frustration boil over. He grabs a knife and starts stabbing her. Not just once or twice, many times, frenzied, out of control. The act of violence, the sight of blood, the child screams. Somehow this succeeds where normal sexual stimulation failed. He achieves erection and ejaculation, not through intercourse, but through violence and murder. This is the moment when Andrei Chikatilo discovers what works for him sexually. Not normal sex, not consensual sex, not even rape, but murder. Specifically, the murder of helpless victims who can't fight back. When he's finished, he realizes what he's done. There's blood everywhere, a child's corpse in his house. He panics. He wraps the body in cloth, waits until after dark, and carries it to the Grushevka River nearby. He throws it in, hoping the current will carry it away, hoping it will never be found. But he's amateur at this. He doesn't know what he's doing. The body gets caught in reeds near the riverbank. 2 days later, December 24th, Christmas Eve in the West, though Soviet Union didn't officially celebrate Christmas, a local man discovers Lenka Zakotnova's frozen corpse. The militia launches an investigation immediately. This is the murder of a child in a small town. Everyone is terrified and angry. The detectives work hard, questioning everyone, following every lead. And they get lucky. Several people saw Lenka walking with a man on December 22nd. Witnesses describe him, middle-aged, glasses, intelligent-looking. They narrow down the suspect list. Chikatilo's name comes up. He lives near where the body was found. He has no alibi for that evening. Detectives question him multiple times. But there's a problem. In Soviet Union, they're just starting to use blood type analysis in criminal investigations, and they're not very good at it. They test the semen found on Lenka's body. It's type AB. They test Chikatilo's blood. It's type A. This doesn't match. Now, here's the crazy thing that nobody knows at the time. Chikatilo has an extremely rare condition where his blood type and his semen type are different. His blood is type A, but his other bodily fluids, saliva, sweat, semen, are type AB. This is called a non-secretor condition, incredibly rare, and Soviet forensic science doesn't understand it. So based on the blood type evidence, the detectives rule out Chikatilo. They decide he's not the killer. Instead, they focus on another man, someone with an actual criminal record. His name is Alexander Kravchenko, a 25-year-old with previous conviction for sexual assault. He happened to be in the area around the time of the murder, and he has type AB blood. The militia arrests Kravchenko. They interrogate him for days. They beat him. Torture was still common in Soviet criminal justice system. Eventually, probably just to stop the torture, Kravchenko confesses. He signs a statement saying he killed Lenka Zakotnova. He's convicted and sentenced to death. In Soviet Union, death penalty was carried out by a single gunshot to the back of the head. On July 13, 1983, they execute Alexander Kravchenko for a murder he didn't commit. Meanwhile, Chikatilo gets away with it. He's questioned, then released. The detectives apologize for bothering him. And now he knows he can do this again. He got away with it. The militia is incompetent. The forensic science is flawed. And the incredible sexual release he felt during the murder, that's something he needs to experience again. So he waits, he plans, he fantasizes, and 3 years later, in 1981, he kills again. Part 4. The Body Count Rises, 1981 to 1984. After Lenka's murder in 1978, Chikatilo manages to control himself for nearly 3 years. Maybe he's scared of getting caught. Maybe he's trying to convince himself it was a one-time accident, a moment of madness. Or maybe he just hasn't found the right opportunity. But the urges don't go away. They get stronger. In September 1981, he's in Rostov-on-Don, near the train station. He's no longer working as a schoolteacher. He got fired from his last teaching job after one too many complaints about inappropriate behavior with students. Now he's working as a snobzhenets, a supply clerk for a factory. This is actually perfect cover for what he's about to become, because supply clerks in Soviet Union had to travel constantly between different cities and factories, trying to obtain scarce materials. In Soviet planned economy, everything was in deficit, shortage, you understand? If your factory needed ball bearings or rubber hoses or metal sheets, you couldn't just order them. You had to send someone to physically travel to other factories, negotiate, trade, barter, sometimes bribe officials. Supply clerks spent all their time on trains and buses, traveling from city to city, sleeping in cheap hostels, basically invisible to everyone. This gives Chikatilo perfect opportunity. He's constantly traveling, nobody questions where he is or what he's doing, and train stations become his hunting ground. September 3rd, 1981. Rostov-on-Don train station. He sees Larisa Tkachenko, 17 years old, waiting for someone. He strikes up a conversation, invites her to walk with him to the nearby forest. She agrees. Maybe she's naive. Maybe she trusts him because he looks respectable. Maybe she's just bored. They walk into the Lesopolosa, the forest belt near the city, and he kills her. Same pattern as Lenka, but even more brutal. He strangles her first, then mutilates her body with his knife. The violence allows him to achieve sexual release. He leaves the body in the forest, covered with leaves. This becomes his method. Find vulnerable people at train stations or bus stops. Lure them to isolated areas with promises or friendly conversation, then attack. Who does he target? Mostly children and young people. Runaways, orphans, students traveling alone. In late Soviet Union, there were a lot of these. The social system was falling apart. Families were drinking themselves to death. Kids ran away from abuse and neglect. Train stations were full of desperate young people with nowhere to go. Also prostitutes. Yes, Soviet Union had prostitutes, even though officially prostitution didn't exist in communist society. These women worked near train stations, desperate for money. If a respectable-looking man offered to pay them, they'd go with him anywhere. Chikatilo developed a system. He'd approach someone vulnerable. He'd talk to them, gain their trust. He'd suggest they go somewhere private, to the forest to talk, to his dacha for tea, to a secluded spot where it's quieter. Once they were isolated, he'd attack. The pattern was always similar: attempted sexual assault, failure due to his impotence, rage and frustration boiling over into extreme violence. He'd stab them dozens of times, mutilate their bodies, remove organs, sometimes eat pieces of flesh. The violence itself became sexual for him. He'd ejaculate during the killing, not before or after, but during the act of mutilation. 1982, he kills 8 people. 8. 1983, he kills 7. 1984, he kills 15. 15 in 1 year. The bodies start appearing all over the Rostov Oblast. That's the region around Rostov-on-Don, about the size of Maryland. Forest belts near train stations, abandoned buildings, vacant lots. The victims are children, teenagers, young adults, boys and girls, though more girls than boys, all mutilated in similar ways: stab wounds, missing organs, signs of sexual assault. By 1983, the Soviet authorities can't ignore it anymore. They have a serial killer. Multiple serial killers, maybe. They're not sure if it's one person or several, but definitely something is very wrong. Here's where the Soviet ideology becomes a huge problem. In communist theory, serial killers are a product of capitalist society: greed, alienation, decay of moral values under capitalism. Serial killers don't exist in socialist society because socialism creates the new Soviet man, psychologically healthy, morally pure, dedicated to collective good. This isn't just propaganda. Soviet officials genuinely believed this. When psychologists and criminologists suggested they might have a serial killer, party officials resisted. That's impossible. Serial killers are an American problem. This must be multiple unrelated crimes, or perhaps organized crime, but not a lone psychopath. This ideological blindness costs lives. If they'd acknowledged what they were dealing with earlier, if they'd mobilized resources faster, many victims might have been saved. But eventually, the evidence is too overwhelming to ignore. In 1983, Moscow sends a special team to Rostov to investigate. They set up a task force with one mission: catch the killer. The lead investigator is a man named Isa Kostoyev. He's a major in the militia, smart guy, experienced detective. He looks at all the cases and sees the pattern: train stations, forest belts, similar mutilations, similar victim profiles. He creates a profile of the killer: adult male, probably 45 to 50 years old, educated, respectable appearance, job that requires travel, likely sexually dysfunctional, knowledge of the region. The killer is organized, plans his attacks, targets vulnerable people who won't be missed immediately. Kostoyev sets up surveillance at train stations. Undercover officers watch for suspicious men approaching children or young people. They question thousands of people, investigate 10,000 suspects. But Chikatilo is careful. He doesn't kill in the same place twice. He varies his methods slightly. He travels to different cities, not just Rostov, but Shakhty, Novocherkassk, other towns in the region. Sometimes he goes farther, to Krasny Sulin, to Gukovo, even to other regions. One time, militia almost catches him. October 1983 in Novocherkassk train station. Undercover officer sees Chikatilo talking to a young boy. trying to lure him away. The officer intervenes, questions Chikatilo, but Chikatilo has explanation. He's a supply clerk for his factory, traveling on business, just being friendly to the child. The officer has no grounds to arrest him, so he lets him go. The boy is safe, but Chikatilo escapes again. From 1983 to 1985, the investigation becomes massive. They set up checkpoints at train stations. They patrol forest areas. They interview tens of thousands of people. They use psychological profiling, forensic analysis, everything they can think of. And still, the bodies keep appearing. Public panic spreads throughout the region. Parents won't let their children out alone. People avoid train stations. Rumors spread. It's a cult. It's multiple killers. It's a conspiracy. It's the KGB testing mind control experiments. The militia is under enormous pressure. They need results, so they do what desperate Soviet authorities always did. They start arresting people who look suspicious, people with mental problems, people with criminal records. They torture confessions out of them. They convict several innocent people of individual murders. But the real killer, Andrei Chikatilo, continues his work. Part 5. The investigation evolves, 1984 to 1987. The Soviet authorities are throwing everything they have at the investigation. The case, which they're calling Lesa Polosa, Forest Belt, has become a national priority. Not public, you understand. Soviet media isn't reporting on it, because officially, serial killers don't exist in USSR. But within the Ministry of Internal Affairs and KGB, everybody knows. They assign more than 200 detectives to the case. They set up a special headquarters in Rostov. They bring in forensic experts from Moscow, psychiatrists, criminologists. Isa Kostoyev, the lead investigator, is working 18-hour days. They use computer analysis, very new technology in Soviet Union at this time, to look for patterns. They map all the murders, all the victims, all the timing. The computers are huge, room-sized machines, but they help identify connections. The pattern is clear. Train stations, forest belts. Victims are vulnerable young people, similar mutilations. Time frame suggests one killer, or maybe a small group. They conduct psychological profiling, also very new in Soviet Union, mostly learned from American FBI methods. The profile they develop is remarkably accurate. Male, 40s to 50s, educated, respectable appearance, job requires travel, sexually dysfunctional, organized and intelligent, knows the region well. In November 1984, they catch a break. A woman named Anna Lemesheva, 19 years old, is approached by a man at a train station. He's trying to lure her into the forest. She refuses, gets scared, reports it to militia. They show her photo albums of suspects. She identifies a man, Andrei Chikatilo. Investigators pull his file, and they find something interesting. Back in 1978, he was questioned about the murder of Lenka Zakhanova. Back in 1981 and 1982, his name came up in connection with other missing children. Parents said they saw their kids talking to a man matching his description. And just last year, in 1983, he was questioned at Novocherkassk station for talking to a young boy. This is suspicious, very suspicious. They start surveillance on Chikatilo. They watch him at train stations, follow him when he travels for his supply clerk job. They see him approaching young people, trying to start conversations. Always polite, always friendly, but something feels wrong about it. In December 1984, they decide to arrest him. Not for murder. They don't have enough evidence yet. But they search his home and find some concerning items. A knife, rope, a jar of Vaseline. Not enough to prove murder, but enough to charge him with something. They hold him in jail for 3 months, investigating. But here's the problem. They test his blood type. It's type A. The semen found on victims is type AB. It doesn't match. Soviet forensic science still doesn't understand the rare condition where someone's blood type differs from their secretion type. This crucial evidence actually works against the investigation. Without solid proof, they have to let him go. But first, they charge him with something else: theft of state property. Remember that roll of linoleum and car battery from earlier? They use that. It's a minor charge, but it gets him fired from his supply clerk job. Chikatilo gets 3 months in jail for theft. Then he's released. Now he's unemployed, angry, humiliated. His wife is furious with him. His reputation is destroyed. But on the positive side, from his twisted perspective, he's no longer under surveillance. The militia thinks they've ruled him out as a suspect because of the blood-type mismatch. In 1985, something interesting happens. Chikatilo barely kills at all. Only 2 murders that year. Why? Probably because he was in jail for part of the year, under surveillance for another part, and generally scared after his arrest. But there's another reason. His life improves. He gets a new job with a different factory as supply clerk. He gets promoted to head of supply department. He earns enough money to buy a used Lada, Soviet car. Piece of shit, but still a car, which was prestigious. He moves his family from communal apartment to a real 2-room apartment in Novocherkassk. Huge upgrade in Soviet Union. For the first time in his life, things are going well. And when life is going well, he doesn't feel the same compulsion to kill. The rage diminishes. The need for revenge against the world lessens. This tells us something important about his psychology. The murders weren't just sexual. They were about power, about asserting control, about punishing a world that had humiliated him. When the world treated him better, when he felt respected and successful, he could control his urges. But it doesn't last. In 1986, things start going downhill again. Problems at work, problems at home, stress accumulating. The urges return. He kills 3 people in 1986. He kills 3 people in 1987. Less than his peak years, but still, he's active. The bodies continue appearing in forest belts, with the same brutal mutilations. The investigation, meanwhile, has stalled. Yes, they're still watching train stations, still investigating suspects, still trying. But they've interviewed tens of thousands of people, investigated thousands of suspects, and they're no closer to catching the killer. Morale among the investigators is low. Some think the killer has died or moved away. Some think he's deliberately stopped to avoid capture. Some think they're looking for the wrong type of person. Only Isa Kostoyev refuses to give up. He keeps going over the evidence, keeps refining the profile, keeps watching and waiting. And in 1988, the killing spree accelerates again. Part 6, The Final Years, 1988 to 1990. By 1988, the Soviet Union is falling apart. Mikhail Gorbachev has introduced glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. The communist system is collapsing. Store shelves are empty. Crime is exploding. People are desperate and scared. In this chaos, Chikatilo finds new opportunities. He kills 8 people in 1988. He kills 9 people in 1989. His methods have evolved. He's more careful about disposing of bodies. He travels farther from home. He targets people in different cities and regions. Sometimes he goes to Ukraine, sometimes to other parts of Russia. But he always returns to familiar territory. The Rostov region, the train stations he knows, the forest belts he's mapped out over the years. One change: he's targeting more boys and young men. Why? Possibly because surveillance at train stations has increased and girls are more protected. Or possibly his tastes have shifted. Or maybe boys are just easier targets, more likely to be runaways, less likely to be accompanied by adults. The murders follow the same pattern: approach a train station, lure to isolated area, brutal attack, mutilation, body left in forest. In May 1989, Chikatilo kills an 8-year-old boy named Alexei Kobatov in the Ukraine. It's one of his most brutal murders. The child is literally torn apart. In August 1989, he kills a 10-year-old girl named Tatiana Rizhova. He removes her eyes. This is new, something he hasn't done before. When psychiatrists later ask him why, he'll say, "So she couldn't see me from the other world." This shows his deteriorating mental state. He's becoming more paranoid, more superstitious, more disconnected from reality. The investigation continues, but it's hampered by the chaos of late Soviet collapse. Resources are scarce. Detectives are overworked. The command structure is breaking down. Different regions don't communicate well with each other. But then, in 1990, they get new leadership. A detective named Viktor Burakov takes over much of the investigative work. He's smart, dedicated, and he has a new idea: stop focusing on blood types and start focusing on behavior patterns. Burakov orders his team to create a comprehensive database of every suspicious person seen at train stations. Not just people with criminal records, not just people who match the victim blood type, but anyone who seems odd, who approaches children, who hangs around platforms with no clear purpose. They also increase visible police presence at stations. Not undercover, very visible. Uniformed militia everywhere. The idea is to make the killer nervous. Force him to make mistakes. It starts working. In September 1990, they identify several men who keep appearing at different stations, who approach young people, who behave suspiciously. They don't have enough evidence to arrest anyone, but they're creating a watch list. One name appears multiple times: Andrei Chikatilo. Yes, the same Andrei Chikatilo, who was ruled out years ago because of the blood type. But Viktor Burakov doesn't care about the blood type anymore. He cares about behavior, and Chikatilo's behavior is suspicious. Then comes November 6, 1990. Svetlana Korostik's murder, the one I described at the beginning. This is the turning point. Finally, after 12 years and 53 murders, they have him. Igor Rybakov, the militiaman in plain clothes, sees Chikatilo emerge from the forest with leaves on his clothes and scratch on his face. He takes down Chikatilo's information. When Svetlana's body is found days later, when Rybakov reports what he saw, the investigators immediately cross-reference with their watch list. Andrei Chikatilo, seen at multiple train stations, approached young people, previously investigated and released, and now seen near a fresh crime scene with scratches on his face. They put him under 24-hour surveillance. 4 teams, rotating shifts, watching him constantly. They're not taking any chances this time. For 2 weeks, they watch him. He goes to work, comes home, visits train stations, talks to young people. He doesn't kill again. Probably he senses he's being watched, or maybe he's just satisfied after Svetlana. On November 20th, 1990, they make the arrest. Chikatilo walks out of a cafe, and suddenly he's surrounded by armed officers. They slam him against a car, put him in handcuffs, throw him in a police van. This time they're not letting him go. Part 7, Confession and Trial, 1990 to 1992. The interrogation room in Rostov militia headquarters is small, gray, cold. Very Soviet, you know? Concrete walls, single light bulb, metal table, 2 chairs. Like something from a spy movie, except it's real. For 9 days, Andrei Chikatilo sits there in silence. The detectives try everything. They show him photos of victims. They present evidence: clothes found near crime scenes, witness statements, forensic reports. They lie to him, tell him they have more proof than they actually do. They threaten him with torture, with death penalty, with exposing him to other prisoners who will tear him apart for killing children. Nothing works. Chikatilo just stares at the wall, doesn't respond, doesn't even acknowledge their presence. He's done this before, in 1984, when they arrested him the first time. He knows his rights. He knows that without a confession, their case is mostly circumstantial. But on the ninth day, the psychiatrist Alexander Buchanovsky enters the room. Buchanovsky is different from the detectives. He's not aggressive, not accusatory. He sits down, lights a cigarette, offers one to Chikatilo. He starts talking, but not about the crimes. He talks about childhood trauma, about a boy who grew up during terrible times, war, famine, repression. A boy who was humiliated and abused, who never felt love or acceptance, who was broken by the cruelty of the world. He talks about sexual dysfunction, about the shame and rage it creates, about impotence not as a personal failing, but as a medical condition, a psychological wound that never healed. He talks about the unbearable weight of secrets, of living a double life, of the relief that comes from finally being able to tell the truth. Buchanovsky doesn't accuse, he empathizes. He treats Chikatilo not as a monster, but as a patient, a damaged human being who deserves to be understood. And somehow, incredibly, it works. On November 29th, 1990, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo begins to cry, and then he begins to talk. For the next several weeks, he confesses to 53 murders. 53. He describes each one in detail. The victim's name when he knew it, the date, the location, the method, what he did to the body. He draws maps showing where he left bodies. He provides information that only the killer could know. Some bodies haven't been found yet. Based on his confessions, investigators go to forests and fields and recover more remains. In a few cases, they find bodies they didn't even know were his victims. The evidence is overwhelming. The investigation team can prove 52 murders definitively. One confession can't be corroborated with physical evidence, so they don't charge him with that one. But 52 is more than enough. The trial begins in April 1992, more than a year after his arrest. Soviet Union has collapsed by now. It's the Russian Federation, a new country trying to figure out democracy and capitalism and justice. The trial is held in Rostov-on-Don in a large courtroom. For security, Chikatilo is kept in a metal cage in the center of the room. These cages were standard in Soviet and Russian courts, called pusinka, to prevent defendants from attacking anyone or escaping. The courtroom is packed. Victims' families, journalists, curious onlookers. Security is extremely tight, because everyone knows that if given the chance, the families would tear Chikatilo apart with their bare hands. Chikatilo's appearance shocks people. He shaved his head completely bald. His face is gaunt, eyes wild, expression manic. He doesn't look like the mild-mannered schoolteacher anymore. He looks insane, demonic even. Throughout the trial, he behaves erratically. Sometimes he sits calmly, listening to testimony. Sometimes he shouts random statements. I am not a homosexual. I am a monster. I am a beast. Sometimes he pulls down his pants and waves his penis at the court, screaming about his impotence. Sometimes he sings Soviet patriotic songs. The judge has to order him to be quiet multiple times. At one point, they gag him. The prosecution presents the evidence, 52 murder charges, each documented with forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Chikatilo's own confession. They describe the crimes in horrible detail. The courtroom hears about mutilated children, about organs removed and eaten, about unimaginable suffering. Families of victims give statements. Parents of murdered children stand up and describe what they've lost, how their lives were destroyed. Some curse Chikatilo, demanding his death. Some cry silently. Some are so traumatized they can barely speak. Chikatilo's lawyer tries to argue insanity, that his client is mentally ill, not responsible for his actions, deserves treatment rather than punishment. Psychiatrist Alexander Buchanovsky testifies about Chikatilo's psychology, his childhood trauma, his sexual dysfunction, his mental deterioration. But other psychiatrists, appointed by the state, testify that while Chikatilo has personality disorders and paraphilias, he's not legally insane. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He planned his attacks. He took steps to avoid capture. He was in control of his actions, even if those actions were monstrous. The trial lasts 6 months. It's one of the most sensational trials in Russian history. Media coverage is intense. Remember, Soviet censorship is gone now. Journalists can report freely. Newspapers run daily updates. TV news shows excerpts from the trial. The Russian public is horrified and fascinated. This is the first time they've heard openly about serial killers in their country. For 70 years, Soviet propaganda claimed such things didn't exist, that only capitalist societies produced such monsters. Now they're learning that the monster was among them all along, killing for 12 years while authorities covered it up. On October 14, 1992, the judge delivers the verdict, guilty on 52 counts of murder. The sentence, death penalty. In the courtroom, families of victims cheer. Some cry with relief. Chikatilo shows no emotion, just stares straight ahead. Under Russian law at the time, death penalty means execution by a single gunshot to the back of the head. But first, Chikatilo has the right to appeal. He spends the next 16 months in prison, writing letters, filing appeals, trying to get his sentence reduced. He writes to President Boris Yeltsin, asking for mercy. He claims his confession was coerced, that he's mentally ill, that he deserves another chance. In one letter to Yeltsin, Chikatilo, the former communist, suddenly becomes a Democrat, praising Russia's new freedom and constitution, denouncing the communist tyranny he lived under. It's pathetic. Transparent attempt to curry favor. Yeltsin rejects the appeal. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day in the West, just another cold February day in Russia, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo is taken to a special room in the prison. He's told to face the wall. A guard places a gun against the back of his skull. One shot, instant death. The Rostov Ripper is gone. But the damage he caused, the trauma he inflicted on dozens of families, on entire communities, on Russian society, that remains. And the questions remain. Why did this happen? How did one man become such a monster? And what does his story tell us about Soviet society, about human nature, about the darkness that can exist in any place at any time? Let's try to understand. Part 8. Understanding the Monster, Psychological Analysis. Okay, so now you know the full story. 53 people dead, mostly children and young adults, killed in the most brutal ways imaginable. And you're probably asking yourself, why? What could make a human being do these things? Let me walk you through Chikatilo's psychology, based on the psychiatric evaluations, his own statements, and what we know about his life. First, understand that Chikatilo himself tried to explain his actions. After his arrest, he wrote an autobiography. He called it Biography of Defendant A.R. Chikatilo, Citizen of USSR, Victim of Famine and Cannibalism of 1933 and 1947, Stalinist Repressions, Stagnation and Perestroika Crisis. The title tells you everything about how he saw himself. As a victim, always a victim, never responsible, always suffering from external forces beyond his control. Let's break down the key factors. Childhood trauma. Chikatilo grew up in hell. His father was branded a traitor and sent to Gulag. His mother was abusive. He was malnourished, developed brain damage from hydrocephalus. He suffered from enuresis until age 12, was beaten and humiliated for it daily. He was told his brother was eaten by cannibals. He was bullied at school, had no friends, no support system, no escape. This created massive insecurity, low self-esteem, and deep-seated rage. But lots of people have terrible childhoods and don't become serial killers. So trauma is part of the explanation, but not all of it. Sexual dysfunction. This is crucial. Chikatilo's impotence wasn't just embarrassing. In Soviet masculine culture, it was utterly emasculating. Men were supposed to be strong, dominant, sexual. A man who couldn't perform was considered worthless, not a real man. Every time he failed sexually, with his fiancée, with his wife, in his desperate attempts throughout his life, it reinforced his sense of inadequacy and rage. He felt powerless, defective, inferior. And here's the key. Violence became his only way to achieve sexual release. He discovered that stabbing, mutilating, killing, these acts excited him in a way normal sexuality never could. The sight of blood, the screams of victims, the complete power over another person. This was what worked for him. Psychiatrists would later classify him as having sadistic sexual disorder, necrophilia, and possible paraphilias related to cannibalism. But those are just labels. The reality is simpler. His sexuality was completely broken, and violence was the only thing that functioned. Power and control. It's not just about sex, though. Maybe not even primarily about sex. It's about power. His entire life, Chikatilo was powerless. Powerless as a child against bullies and his abusive mother. Powerless as a young man rejected by women and society. Powerless as a husband in a loveless marriage. Powerless as a teacher mocked by students. Powerless as a worker pushed around by bosses. But in the forest, with a knife in his hand and a helpless victim before him, in that moment, he was God. He had absolute power. He could decide life or death. Nobody could humiliate him, reject him, mock him. He was in complete control. The mutilations weren't random. Cutting off boys' genitals and girls' uteruses and breasts, this was symbolic. He was destroying the sexual organs that functioned properly, that mocked his own dysfunction. It was revenge against a world of sexually normal people who had everything he lacked. The 2-year gap. Remember that from 1985 to 1987, he barely killed? This is extremely telling. During those years, his life improved significantly. He got promoted, earned more money, bought a car, moved to a better apartment. He felt successful, respected, powerful, and he didn't need to kill as much. This proves the murders weren't just about sexual urges. They were about psychological need for power, for revenge, for asserting control over a world that had beaten him down his entire life. When life was good, when he felt respected, the compulsion diminished. When life was bad, when he felt humiliated and powerless, the compulsion returned with full force. Symbolism and ritual. Alexander Bukhanovsky noted that Chikatilo was obsessed with symbolism. The tongue cutting. Psychiatrists believe this represented his own inability to speak up for himself throughout his life, his voicelessness. By taking victims' tongues, he was symbolically taking their voice, their power to accuse him. Eating parts of victims, particularly sexual organs, this was a primitive, almost magical attempt to absorb their power, their sexual function, their vitality. Removing eyes in later murders, so they couldn't see him from the other world. This shows growing paranoia and superstition, signs of mental deterioration. Communist ideology. Here's something interesting. Chikatilo was a true believer in communism his entire life. Even during his trial, even after everything, he still thought of himself as a good Soviet citizen who was betrayed by the system. He believed he had been failed by the state that allowed his father to be repressed, failed by a society that humiliated him for his disability, failed by an economic system that kept him poor, failed by educators who didn't recognize his potential. In his mind, The murders were almost like revenge against Soviet society. Every victim was a strike back at the world that had wronged him. He was reclaiming power from a system that had kept him powerless. Empathy deficit. Despite all his self-pity, despite seeing himself as a victim, Chikatilo showed zero empathy for the people he killed. When asked about the children, the young people whose lives he destroyed, he couldn't articulate any sense of their humanity. They were objects to him, tools for his sexual gratification and psychological needs. This is the mark of true psychopathy, not in the Hollywood sense of being smooth and charming, but in the clinical sense of lacking normal human empathy and conscience. The final verdict. The Soviet and then Russian courts ruled that Chikatilo was sane. He had personality disorders, yes. Paraphilias, yes. But he understood that what he was doing was wrong. He took steps to avoid capture. He planned his attacks. He functioned normally in daily life. He wasn't insane. He was evil, if you believe in evil as a concept. Or he was profoundly damaged and dangerous, if you prefer clinical terminology. Alexander Buchanovsky argued that Chikatilo should be studied, not executed. His brain should be preserved for research, his psychology documented in detail. There was so much to learn about how a human being becomes a monster. But Russian society in 1994 wasn't interested in studying Chikatilo. They wanted him dead, and honestly, after 53 victims, after 12 years of terror, who can blame them? So they executed him, and whatever insights his brain might have provided, whatever we might have learned from further study, that opportunity was lost. What we're left with is the story. The cautionary tale of Andrei Chikatilo, the boy who was broken by trauma, warped by dysfunction, consumed by rage, and who took his pain out on the most innocent and vulnerable. So that's the story of Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper. 53 people, mostly kids, killed in ways that, man, even thinking about it now makes me sick. You know what's the crazy thing? In 1990, when he was caught, people in Russia started saying a phrase, «Пусть с тобой будет то же, что с Андреем Chikatilo». May the same happen to you as happened to Andrei Chikatilo. They'd say this to enemies, to people who owed them money, to anyone who crossed them. And even today, in Russia, when we talk about someone who's cruel, sadistic, someone with no conscience, we call them Chikatilo. It's like how you Americans might say someone is a real Jeffrey Dahmer or something like that. Every new serial killer in Russia, they get compared to Chikatilo. He's the standard, the benchmark for horror. He's entered our folklore, become a symbol of pure evil. But here's what I want you to understand, because this is important. Chikatilo was a product of Soviet society as much as he was an individual monster. Think about all the factors that enabled him. The ideology that refused to admit serial killers could exist in communist society. This delayed the investigation for years, cost many lives. The incompetent forensic science that couldn't understand basic blood type variations. This let him escape justice in 1978 and again in 1984. The social stigma around sexual dysfunction and mental illness. This meant nobody helped him when he was young, when maybe intervention could have prevented the murders. The chaos of late Soviet society, with desperate people at train stations, runaways everywhere, weak law enforcement, social collapse. This provided him with endless, vulnerable victims. The trauma of Stalin's repressions, the Holodomor famine, World War II, the return of POWs labeled as traitors. This created the childhood hell that broke his mind. I'm not excusing what he did. 53 people. 53. Their families, their friends, everyone who loved them, they suffered too. That suffering is real, and nothing justifies what Chikatilo did. But I'm saying, monsters aren't born, they're made. And Soviet society, with all its cruelty and dysfunction and ideological blindness, it made Andrei Chikatilo. Could this happen again? Could another Chikatilo emerge? In modern Russia, with better forensic science, better communication between police departments, better understanding of serial killers. Probably not on the same scale. We'd catch 'em faster. But the factors that create monsters, childhood trauma, sexual dysfunction, social humiliation, mental illness, rage building up over a lifetime, these still exist. In Russia, in America, everywhere. And as long as these factors exist, and as long as we fail to identify and help damaged people before they break completely, well, there will always be monsters among us. Vasya lights another cigarette, takes a sip of tea. Okay, that's it. That's the full story of the Rostov Ripper. I hope you learned something about Russia, about Soviet history, about human nature, both its darkness and its resilience. The families of the victims, they're still living with the pain. The investigators who worked this case, some of them still have nightmares. The society that failed to stop Chikatilo for 12 years, we're still grappling with that failure. But we remember. We tell these stories so we don't forget what humans are capable of, both the terrible and the heroic. The investigators who never gave up, the psychiatrist who broke through Chikatilo's silence, the families who survived and found ways to keep living despite unimaginable loss. That's the real story, you know? Not just the horror, but the humanity that persists despite the horror. He stubs out his cigarette, looks directly at the camera. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay curious about the darker corners of history. And remember, monsters are real, but so is the strength to fight them.